Okay, so you've heard the solution, and now you're going to hear from a couple of guys that are kind of the poster child for a hunk of chunk of burn and need for that solution. Fred Mednick, who is the founder of Teachers Without Borders, and Ross Stein from the U.S. Geological Service.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the need for, I guess, DTN being a disaster-tolerant network, and how important that is. But first, introduce myself. My name is Fred Mednick. I'm the head of Teachers Without Borders. I started it in 2000 to connect. Thanks. To connect teacher professional development with international development. Because teachers are the largest professionally trained group in the world, 59 to 65 million of them. They are there in those communities. Brains are evenly distributed around the world. And I wanted to connect those brains to information and each other in order to close an education divide and connect with all the networks that are out there. So this is a presentation in many ways about the connection between networks and saving lives, and how important in many ways DTN can be for the process of supporting earthquake science and safety, which is a project that I want to say in pictures here. And so while we're talking about ring road satellites and these extraordinary innovations, I wrote down all the three-letter words that I have to remember, a little later. I want to talk about this in a different way, education from below the ground and up. And I want to give you, since there's no delay here, I want to show you a little bit of something from Dushanbe, Tajikistan. And in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, there are earthquakes all the time. And I can tell you this, that the information that's needed can wait a few minutes because we know that we can depend upon it. We know that it's reliable, if it's ubiquitous, and it's lower cost. We're talking about saving lives here. So I'd like to start by giving you a sense of my life, what we have to deal with out in the field in places like Dushanbe, Tajikistan.
این زمینجویی چه با وجود میاد خیلی از چی سبب موضوع نفهم موقع خوب نمیدونیم از چی سبب
فکر میکنی چرا زمین میجوبه؟
یک جاداری است که وای به مثل حیوان است اگر وای جنبد زمین جوبی میشه
یک خلاص میگن که مثلا در تک زمین یک دو دارد و در درونش دو تا پشه در میاد یک تاش منفی و مثبت اگر که مثلا وقتی که یک پشه در شاخش میشنه و در پشه رو دور کنه دست بود و در اونجا زمین میجوبه.
Oops. Let's see. Now, this slide here, I took this picture is in Kashmir. And I want to tell you a story about our experience going through, moving actually through an observation of disasters and earthquakes and an open-mouthed answers I got to questions about earthquake science and safety, to an active project that's been all over the world now, to chance meetings, to getting connected with Ross Stein at USGS, to ending up speaking about this with the education department at the White House, and now the real push, since there have been so many projects, for us to be able to scale this because of these pilots. So in 2001, I was in Gujarat. There was the earthquake there, and I asked questions. Did you know what to do? Do you know what an earthquake is? Is there any training? And there was absolutely nothing. And then in 2005, was the Kashmir earthquake, and schools falling down, buildings crushing kids. And in this earthquake, I couldn't stand it anymore. So we put together a very large relief effort. But still, this was a relief effort. This was temporary. Tens of thousands of people got winterized tents before the snows came, and they cordoned off the area and considered it a graveyard. And so charity or support or relief is not going to help. Education is going to help. Science is going to help. Teacher professional development is going to help. Teacher networks connecting up with science, that's going to help. And so it happens again and again and again. 50% of the kids who perish in earthquakes around the world, an aggregated figure, die in their schools. They die in their schools. And if you think about this, Haitians have traditionally run indoors instinctively and immediately whenever there's a civil disturbance or a natural disaster. You go for protection. By this time, we have hundreds of thousands of people who are building phobic. They're school phobic. There is 300,000 people lost their lives. But when we started interviewing engineering teachers with some modicum of science background, the incidence of death and injury in classrooms in Haiti, where there had been some form of earthquake science and safety education in any form whatsoever, there were far fewer. We interviewed teacher after teacher. And so we've seen many people have observed the same tragic thing again and again, for which something like this is begging, for support. Here it is. Here's the tragic recipe for catastrophe. Dense populations, unreinforced schools. And Ross will tell you about these schools and what it takes to reinforce a school, and what does it mean when you have a school where, this top floor falls on the bottom floor. Shallow earthquakes. The Haitian earthquake was 13 kilometers or so beneath the surface of the earth. That's basically on the surface of the earth. And those fissures were enormous. This is the last thing. Little quake science or safety. Again and again and again. Cannot tell you how many times we've seen this. So the reason I'm bringing up one more of these pictures is because this is not just a situation of an observation and a humanitarian effort to try to make a difference. I mean, that alone. It's also personal. I lived in China. I returned to China to teach, and we had a project in China in 2006 in Dujiangyan for a couple of years. And it was a science inquiry training project, and lots of local teachers, hundreds of them, and government agencies. And it was a glorious, wonderful experience. And please don't anyone ask me, my Chinese sucks. But I fell in love with the people and the area of Dujiangyan. Now, Dujiangyan is in Sichuan province, and Dujiangyan is a kind of a tourist, an ancient city with these ancient dams and a whole waterway network from 250 BC. I mean, it's just this enormous kind of thing. But Dujiangyan was the epicenter of the earthquake in the Wenchuan earthquake near Dujiangyan in 2008. And I remember the moment. I was driving, and I heard there was an earthquake in China. I heard there was an earthquake in Sichuan, and then I heard, the name Dujiangyan. An NPR reporter had been interviewing people in the community, experienced this earthquake, so that name got out. And I have to say that, I lost the teachers, and we lost the buildings. And I thought I was going to lose my mind. I went to everybody I can find. Networks of people were the first people I approached. Cisco was a company that had consistently supported science inquiry, emergency work. I went to them. We went to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. The foundations came through. Networks came through. Engineers came through. And it was an extraordinary response. And the director of education in Sichuan province and in Duzhengyan said, could you transform this program from science inquiry into a program about safety? Safety in science, earthquake science. And there's an amazing moment when I put out into the network, I need to make this transformation happen, this earthquake science and safety program. I've seen enough. This tragic thing is happening again and again. We need information. We can wait a few minutes. We need it to be secure. We need it to have governments not mess with it or people try to mess with it. I need to know that the training or the information or the data is going to get there. It's absolutely, the delay is worth it. But I put this out on the network and found someone, in the power of this network, found someone named Solmaz Mohajir, born in Iran, did her geological graduate work in Pakistan, and began and was working on a program of earthquake science and safety because some of the stuff is just not accurate. So Solmaz is a Teachers Without Borders member, and we got in touch, and the network was enlisted. Geologists, Cisco made sure it was our work was translated into Chinese. And here is the connection I want to make between earthquake science and safety, and the power of a teacher, and international development.
Here at Teachers Without Borders focuses on preparedness and planning. We taught a workshop in April 2009 and focused on earthquake science, safety, and mitigation. And all of these concepts were introduced through several interactive, hands-on, inquiry-based lesson plans. We know emergency education can save lives. We know very well that even one retrofitted school can save thousands of lives. Teachers do have a voice, and unfortunately their voices are not being heard.
Now you can imagine we put all this in place. It was 2009 when we got started back in China again with a completely new program. Hewlett and Cisco helped to fund that program, and it is long since that those funds were long since spent. The program, however, is strong and going there, adopted by government and incorporated into curriculum and little booklets in backpacks for kids. And it's in 6 languages. It's free. The organization is bound and obligated morally to make sure that this content is made available without disruption, and that it is available in a way that can be adapted and adopted and made acceptable and available and accessible in a form that matters to communities. And the culture I do want to introduce here today, this notion of the power of culture in teacher development, having the network of people not necessarily descending upon the community to do a drive-by teacher program, but enlisting the capacity of those teachers who are the natural ambassadors for their culture and who are able to make it happen. Now in Tajikistan, Solma speaks a language. She speaks several languages, and at the very end of this is a brief video is actually going to be connected here in some strange way from bulls and mosquitoes underneath the earth to satellites in a moment. But Hewlett also, and someone from the Department of Education said, you need to meet Ross Stein at USGS. Ross Stein and USGS had been doing an enormous amount of similar work. And you know how it is with the NGO world. We do these pilots, and then we have to, we're tyrannized by the urgent in order to scale them and sustain them. And why not combine forces? Why not use the network to combine forces? And that, to me, was a marriage made in heaven. And a couple of years ago, the White House asked us to present there so that we could be able to make a point about not just public-private partnerships, but there's another point here. It's a sort of political, maybe geopolitical point, is that when I began to look at the seismic vulnerable regions of the world, you respond to earthquakes, and we did with, relief. And then you start to think about the likelihood of earthquakes and the consistency of earthquakes. The teachers need the science people. The science specialists need this army of people on the ground to make this real. It's a symbiotic relationship. And what ended up happening is I looked at that map of the world, the seismic regions, and they looked exactly the same as the educational fault lines. There's just, again, lousy buildings, high density, unreinforced, schools, shallow earthquakes, no science and safety. So the White House was particularly interested, as I am very pleased, to note the effort, especially the idea that this is open educational resources, and that the one thing we have not yet talked about is the ability for this information not just to get there, but to be adapted and adopted and to be open and available and free, which is something very powerful. And so the Equal Futures Partnership of the White House has said this is an effort worth exploring and moving forward. So what I'd like to do, since I don't want to be perceived as, the touchy-feely humanitarian guy, is because of the nature of our science program, is to show you the connection to USGS and their efforts so that we see actually right here the blend of the science educator and the scientist. So Ross?
Thank you, Fred. So the White House solicited this proposal. The White House doesn't fund this proposal, but let me give you a sense of the dimensions of the problem that we have for earthquakes today. This is just population in Europe and North Africa. Until I saw this map, I didn't realize that Egypt is not a country. It's a river. It's just a river of humanity in inky blackness. The other thing I hadn't appreciated until I looked at it is that nobody's home in Switzerland. Now, if we overlay on this map the cities at risk for earthquakes, we'll see some of the ones that we've heard about in the past, such as Istanbul or Athens or Cairo. Now what I want to do is to flip the map over and show you population on the other side of the world using the same density. And if I start to put up the earthquakes, the cities at risk, in fact, megacities at risk for earthquakes here, you now see the full dimension of the problem. You are looking at an enormous part of the world's population highly vulnerable to earthquakes, such as Java, the most populated place on Earth, cheek by jowl against magnitude 8 and 9 earthquakes, or northern India. Somewhere on this map, you are probably looking at the site of the million-death earthquake that we may unfortunately experience in our lifetimes. And although I have no crystal ball, we all saw that when one building fell in Bangladesh, without an earthquake, just under its own weight, 1,000 people died. Bangladesh is susceptible to magnitude 8 earthquakes that can easily fell 1,000 of those buildings. So I submit this is not hyperbole. And if we zoom in on India, we see the full dimension of the problem. India has been in a 40 million year car crash smashing its way into Asia. It's as if you're in a car crash and you're in the back seat. The engine is already in the driver's seat capacity, but in the back you don't even realize an accident is in progress. That's why Tibet has been pushed up as the roof of the earth. And as you can see, the front bumper of that car crash are those red ellipses. Those are the site of magnitude 8 to 9 earthquakes over the last 1,500 years. One earthquake alone in 1897 reduced every masonry building to rubble over an area the size of England. The population is now 10 times higher there. There are 600 million people living in the Ganges Plain susceptible to this kind of disaster. And what makes it worse is there has not been, with the exception of that small Kashmir earthquake that Fred mentioned, a large earthquake here in several generations. So the cultural memory of this problem is lost. So, let's see, okay. So what are we proposing in this initiative? First, Fred talked to you about a hands-on curriculum that we've developed where local teachers would be trained in this and present this to middle school, high school age children. But there's another part of the process, which is a seismometer in every school, a very inexpensive seismometer, and I'm going to show it to you. Okay, so here's the seismometer right here. It's just a small $100 USB seismometer. And this is not only the real deal, which means if we put these in every middle school in a country, we have a seismic network all across the country that has never existed. And such a network is completely comfortable with the delay that we've been talking about today for almost all of its uses. But one of the uses of a network is to explain and teach physics. So for example, what a seismometer is an accelerometer. So if you're trying to teach students the difference between displacement, velocity, and acceleration, it's a very hard concept because it involves derivatives. But here, if I just lift this up and move it from one place to another, what happens is you see I have to accelerate it in one direction and then accelerate in the other direction to stop it. If I move it really slowly, there are no accelerations, and so you don't see anything else happening. Same thing if I move it up, we get acceleration one way, then acceleration downward. So kids should be holding these things, should be learning what acceleration, velocity, and displacement are all about, and the power of having a seismic network in countries where they don't exist is just enormous as a teaching tool. Because most earthquakes are too small to feel, but each one is a teaching moment. Each one is a chance to realize how the earth functions so that the kids don't think it's caused by mosquitoes biting a bull. So what would a seismic network mean in a country like Myanmar, now Burma, or Bangladesh? Both, as you can see, this is 100 years of large earthquakes. They're riddled with earthquakes. What do you do with a network like this that captures not only these magnitude 6 and larger earthquakes, but far small follow-ons? You find the faults. What we could tell you about the earthquake risk in the Bay Area would be near zero if we did not know about the San Andreas, if we did not know about the Hayward Fault. Earthquakes occur on faults. Large earthquakes occur on large faults. Faults are revealed by the occurrence of small earthquakes on them. We also need to measure the ground accelerations because damage is all related to the ground being accelerated like you saw with this. And third, most people live in flat areas. Almost all flat areas on Earth are basins filled with sediments. If you pour a bunch of sand on a drum skin and start beating the drum skin, you know what's going to happen to that sand. Basins amplify the shaking, and understanding that amplification is very important. As an example, Mexico City is built on such a bowl of jelly. It doesn't matter where the earthquake is in Mexico, Mexico City gets hammered. It's just a pathological choice for a capital city. But that's not all we have in mind. That's part of the teaching element. The other part is that GEM, the Global Earthquake Model Foundation, has created a tool for androids that allow anybody to go to a building and assess its vulnerability to earthquakes. And our thought is that these androids would also be given to the schools, and the school children would do a building survey of their school and then move out into the larger community and develop surveys of building vulnerabilities. Unless we know that, we cannot forecast the consequences of earthquakes. And building vulnerability and building inventories are something that we're missing. And we believe this would be a fantastic teaching tool, and that these building surveys would be uploaded to GEM's database. Now let me show you what I mean about buildings. Don't ask me why, but as a society, we have decided to build buildings out of stacks of cubes. Cubes have a particular property. No matter how well this building is bolted to the ground, no matter how strong its columns and beams are, this building is only as strong as its corners. And what happens in an earthquake is the ground moves from side to side. And you can see how weak this building is, despite the strength of these columns and beams. Many earthquakes produce vertical motions. This building is extremely weak with vertical accelerations. All earthquakes produce torsion. If any one of these corners breaks, particularly the lower corners, this building is coming down. And that's because a cube has no structural integrity. You don't believe me? I've made the corners of this cube just a little weaker. Watch. IKEA house. You can fold it up and put it in the back of your station wagon. That's the problem with the cube. Now this is the exact same building, but all I've done is snapped in. I'm going to pop one out to show you I'm not lying. I've just snapped in these little corner braces. Nothing. What is the difference in cost between these buildings? 5%. 5%. And that's the building alone. The value of a building is actually much more of its contents than it is its structure. The problem is that nobody will go from this building to this building unless they're convinced they're at risk. And that takes scientific knowledge about where earthquake hazards are greatest and understanding, so the people who will act on that know what they're talking about. And as long as I'm at it, let me make one more point. Most contractors, when they build a building, even home builders, will try to recover their investment by putting some retail space in the bottom floor. Or maybe it's tuck under parking. Maybe it's a theater, but retail space needs big picture windows, so we can forget about all the shear bracing that's in the bottom floor. And to do that, I'm just going to remove all the corner guys in the bottom. Have I done it? And now I've created the worst building you can possibly build. Engineers call these soft first-story buildings. They're all over the Bay Area, tuck under parking in the marina, and they're all over the world. They are the most common buildings, and that's because they're top-heavy. You see this everywhere. It's a solvable problem. You can strengthen that. But you've got to understand that there's a risk there, or else, frankly, we will all choose the extra bathroom, right, or a nicer kitchen than a building that won't fall down. So that's our job. This can be taught, and part of the program is that mentor engineers from the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute would come in and work with the children, visit some of the surveys with them so they understand what they're doing. So these are the nature, this is the element of the program, and I want to show you, you might be saying to yourself, well, sure, in the developed world, we can build good buildings like this one. By the way, you've probably seen as you walk to lunch, there's lots of triangles on the buildings that are braced here because they're well built. And you say, but that's not something the developing world can afford. That's rubbish. Here is a home-built building. It's heavy, it's strong on the bottom, it's light on the top, it's built of flexible local materials, and it's filled with triangles. Even home-built buildings can be built safely if the person understands this is in the Andes, that earthquakes have a risk. So here's our vision for what this project could produce if it were funded. 1 million buildings surveyed, 100,000 girls educated, 5,000 teachers trained, a network of 1,500 seismometers, and structural engineers monitoring the girls. What do we need? We need internet connectivity. We need DTN. For almost all uses of a seismic network, and for everything I've described, latency is not an issue. There's only one application of a seismic network that needs instant information, and that's if you're using it as an early warning signal, where you need to get information in seconds. But frankly, that's not what the developing world's highest priority is. It's to establish that there is a risk, to understand it, to learn how to live with earthquakes. So now what I'd like to do is turn this back to Fred.
When we conceived of this program, we conceived of it in such a way that it would depend upon networks of engineers and teachers. This awareness is absolutely critical, and there are some new developments on the scene, because one could say, well, let's figure out a way of helping those organizations to build better buildings in these places, or where's the role of DTN or any kind of information exchange. And I think Ross, very clearly talked about one of the biggest problems is reaching people who reach people. And those people live in unreinforced buildings. So there's an organization that I'm quite fond of called the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, INEE, Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. And 4 or 5 years ago, a dramatic thing happened with the group of people who are called the Education Cluster whenever there is any kind of natural or a civil disturbance, a disaster. Because you'd think you just have to climb a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You do the basics first and triage your way up that ladder. What ends up happening is this sort of corollary difficulties in emergencies of things that are so bad that happen when kids are conscripted into military gangs, or there's trafficking that happens, or you lose the kids, or there are no child-friendly spaces. The amazing amount of disasters that happen after the disaster, and that continue to happen as we look at certainly the stream of refugees in Syria going to Jordan and Turkey. What happens to the kids, and in what kinds of buildings do they congregate? So the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, working with Save the Children and the United Nations, has a set of policies. So whenever these emergencies happen, what happens is that there's a cluster of folks that get together. They are the lead. And in many ways, the coordination has gotten better and better. The Philippines is a difficult story, thousands of islands, but for the most part, they coordinate their services. Well, how are they going to coordinate their services? This is one of those needs. But for me, one of the critical developments in policy, and something that I stress in my courses, is the fact that educators are now required to be part of first responder teams. That Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing now is food, water, shelter, clothing, education. And that the child-friendly spaces can count the kids and establish a set of normalcy, and they need information, and they need to connect to each other, and they need to be able to address a whole series of needs and ask questions. So I have to say that I can ask this question about what has been done in other places to deal with X, Y, and Z, and I can wait 5 minutes, 15 minutes a day. And I think we need to depend upon this instead of sitting by the phone, waiting for the phone to ring. And so the notion of education being central to not just the response, but in our particular case, the most powerful thing is the prevention and planning, to get out in front of the issue of earthquake science and safety, to follow those red dots, to connect with those teachers. There is no real network to help with that. There is no of the basic funding to help make sure that happens. And I think that the way in which DTN may be able to get funded and flourish is through its business applications. And at the same time, not to forget that the humanitarian efforts in terms of the capacity building of the countries affected is absolutely extraordinary. It's enormous. And so what we wanted to do is give you sort of a visual sense. I mean, you know, I teach, Ross teaches, and then to end with a very short clip from the very first application of this in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, where those bowls, in theory, underneath the earth. I want to say one thing about the bowls and mosquitoes story, and that is that no one ever trashed that story. No one ever said that's crazy. What Solmaz and other scientists did was work through it. Okay, bowl underneath in the pre-assessment, there's okay, lots of reasons for things. You know, no one was talking about intelligent design, but we were just figuring out here that, okay, that's where your starting point is. Then what? What happens to the earth? Then what? Then what? Then what? Then what's the escape plan? What's happening with tectonics? And how can the students embrace this and teach it and get it to their homes and have the home get it back to them and have structural and non-structural hazards be addressed? Sometimes it's not about this massive campaign to reinforce buildings, but sometimes, you know, that thing that's not attached is going to kill somebody too. It's the way in which it gets taught and how it finds its way. And that's what we are lucky to do with that network. So here's the last clip that will give you a sense of what has happened over a period of time after community after community after community begins to embrace this notion.
Students built a model wall to learn how structural elements such as diagonal braces, shear walls, and rigid connections strengthen a structure and provide a load path during an earthquake.
وقتی ما مثلا کلام میشه کس به انجینری رو میگیریم درباره این چیزها معلومات از خود بدونیم این بخش اصلا میشه باید دیگه که ما خودمون محافظت کردن وقتی که زمین لرزه میشه درخواست بدم محافظت کردن نمیشه و وقتی مثلا شما یک وقتی که تو اومدن یوری تجربی اومدن و ما چه خدمت بدم محافظت کنیم چی در مورد برنامه چیزهای در مورد برای خود 3000 میگم و اون رفتن خیلی با ما هم در دیگه لامه دو آیا وجود داره
دیگه
The worst thing you can do is go on and on. So I just wanted to really to thank Ross. You know, the teacher development piece is a hard one, dealing with large groups. And to make a program together that merges curriculum and connects science and depends upon networks and, you know, and relies upon information is a critical path to change. And so this was a little journey from a bull underneath the earth to a kind of curiosity about Mars. And it doesn't take much, but this is connected to saving lives. So thank you very much, everybody. Yeah. There are questions?
Could you tell us a little more about the age or grade levels of these children? Because, boy, it was really refreshing to see how curious they were. They hang on to that. What was the age range?
The age range began in middle school and stayed there for quite some time. As we began to look at high school ages, we wanted to engage students in more advocacy group, but we want to be very careful. I think one other aspect, and now we're looking at earlier and earlier grades. There are some people that have been doing comic books and graphic work about that. This is the Girls Quake Science and Safety Initiative, and I wanted to make sure. I teach a class on global education and emergencies, and we also teach a class on educating girls. It is really an incontrovertible fact here that the education of girls has this amazing effect on all ranges of society. And so the notion of girls learning the science and assessing the buildings and reporting the data and a certain sense of dignity connected to them is really perfect for the middle school age. And we want to just be sure that they have this opportunity after that curiosity, that we don't break their hearts. So we have, I think about the wonderful nightmare scenario of thousands of kids banging down the doors to keep their education going. But this is through science and safety, and the focus would be on getting the communities involved as well. So that's another age group.
Hi, you guys. Excellent presentation. I saw Seema actually tear up, watching a couple of those videos. It's really powerful. As someone who grew up in India and someone who's very passionate about science, I have a question. Why is it so hard? Ross talked about how simple it is to have structural engineering in the DNA of the design, right? So why is it so hard for the government to approve a plan, right? I mean, we go to the government for approvals on our building structures. Why is it so hard for that design aspect to be embedded in an approval? I mean, it's logical. We have somebody showing it to us as simple as it can get. Why is it so hard, whether it be in the developed world, right? We all live in those fancy communities where we have garages. Why is it so hard?
It's simple. Concrete design is subversive. Most buildings in the world are nominally reinforced concrete, which means there's rebar, ribbed steel rods inside the columns and beams. Can you tell if there are any rebars inside anything here?
No.
Nobody else can either. So there's an enormous opportunity for contractors, either knowingly or unknowingly, to chintz, to save money, and it's extremely difficult once the building is built to see that. I have gone and looked at the destroyed corners of buildings after earthquakes. One in Turkey, I put my hand into the corner to feel how much reinforcing, because in a concrete building it's a denser configuration of rebar in there, and instead of finding rebar, I found hunks of styrofoam. So it's easy to cheat, it's hard to monitor. There are countries who have made a huge effort to both have building construction codes and independently enforce and monitor those, and they've been enormously successful. Chile had relatively no problem with a magnitude 8.8. Kashmir lost 70,000 people in a magnitude 6.9.
So, I'm going to argue this a little bit because, you know, my dad is in construction in India, and he was part of one of the new terminals that opened up in Mumbai, which was state of the art. My dad's VP there, and I love arguing with him, you know, being the only child and everything. But structurally, my question is this, right? I've seen him go to the Indian authorities with a business plan or a, you know, floor plan that he's building for somebody, right? Many, many times. And we've had people come and inspect the buildings, right? Bring it down if needed, right? If it didn't follow the codes. Why can't we have that same level of integrity, whether it be developed country or, you know, third world, where we can actually inspect these things? Don't we have people dropping into restaurants to see if they're up to the health code standard?
Well, our view is that a trained person, a trained middle school girl, could go through buildings and get a very adequate understanding of whether or not that building is at risk. And what we need to do is make that information public. You know, for example, if every building that was substandard had a plaque on it that said this earthquake is not earthquake resistant, people would vote with their feet. They'd go rent something else. The owner wouldn't have tenants. The owner would have to do something about it.
Right.
Transparency is the key.
Yeah.
And I believe that will drive efforts. That's why we need these building surveys. That's why we need the awareness. As long as it's just held secretly by engineers, it won't go anywhere. And by the way, in the Bay Area, when a building owner hires an engineer to inspect their building, the first thing they do is have that engineer sign a non-disclosure agreement. It happens here too.
That's not even a hard question. The harder question that emerges from your question has to do with the issue of exposing the girls or the people who are making that data available and working through the issue of this being a whistleblower exercise or a science exercise. Where we have done this has been in fairly fertile ground, but in very highly volatile areas, both in terms of education and seismographic vulnerability. So the idea is to be able to expose, but that's not the center of the program. It's education.
My question is about technology needs and education, actually. Since we work with content as a content provider, one of the projects that we recently released was an anti-bullying one, which Teachers Without Borders actually picked up, and they took it into grammar schools and then put it on the internet. The other one was not publicly made yet, but it's software we've designed for the anti-abduction of children. And the third one is one that has to do with earthquake preparedness. So if the child was lost or something or under a building, that the software that would be put on the telephones would be linked up. Jennifer might know more about this. I wish our colleague Dan was here today. But is it that you're still looking for this kind of software that's embedded in cell phones so that it can go anywhere? Well, it exists, and we have it. So maybe we should talk afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Wonderful.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. I really hear when you're stressing that you're bringing the information to the children, to the communities, to the people. And I think you're right. I think that's exactly where this needs to come, because governments and corporations, and like you were mentioning, the contractor can save money, or the lady over here was talking about governments should do policies and make sure that there's rules about building. But we've had that, and that's not working. So it's really the consumer, like these kids here, that need to start managing their own lives. And you know, we like to think that we live in a first world right here in San Francisco. But there was an article this week from Bloomberg. Our own Bay Bridge has the earthquake retrofitting problem. And in that case, according to the article, engineers didn't make those decisions. And in our culture, we know to let engineers make those decisions about what bolts to use. But obviously, it was some other bureaucratic thing got in the way, and that bridge isn't apparently safe. So we're in the first world. The problem's everywhere, and I think I love what you guys are doing through teaching.
Thank you.
That's it. Yeah.
We have a stop sign.
One more thing. I'm not clear on one thing that you mentioned. In this area, the building codes, aren't they required to have the steel reinforcing and whatever on the first floor of every building
It was a question about your backyard and building codes here and a worried look on his face.
Yes, there are. And there's new legislation in San Francisco to require that the 60,000 or so unreinforced masonry buildings over the next 15 years or so get retrofitted. So we do have collapse risk buildings. They're a minority. And finally, there is impetus to make those changes.
But
Every new building is well built in this country. You know, there's a factor of about somewhere between the number of people who die in Iran for the same size earthquake we have here is about a factor of 100. So yes, the quality of our buildings ensures the safety of our children.
Thank you very much.